in religious life, as there are in all parts of society, that will be with us for a long time, no matter what happens with COVID. Something has happened. I would argue that we've turned something of a corner in terms of religious engagement with the digital and with online culture. And as a researcher, I wanted to figure out what was going on and what the consequences of that are. The project was very big. I had a team of 6 in a year, and we published our big report recently, which I'm more than happy to share with you. But I'm not going to go through all of it now. What I thought I would do is just give you a few conclusions, a few of the big things that came up, and then answer any questions that you might have about it. And, because I'm talking to the Ark, I have a chance to speak both as myself as a researcher and myself as a congregant and as a member of the Ark.
Josh, sorry, they can't hear you online at the moment. I don't know what's happened now. Okay, try it again.
Okay, can you hear me now? I'm just going to do a little sound test before we decide.
Yes, you're back.
Whether I need to start off again. Okay, I'm not going to go back to the beginning, if that's all right. Just keep going. Yep?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So just a few of the bigger themes that came up. First off, there really is a need for online ritual. There is a huge appetite for it. It wasn't just the Ark, but communities across the country of all sorts of religions noticed that the number of people engaging with online worship was an order of magnitude higher than those who were actually coming into to churches, synagogues, mosques, and so on beforehand. It wasn't easy. They weren't necessarily the same people. They didn't have the same experience. But there was a need there to serve. And that puts pressure on pastoralists, on clergy of all types, on communities to say, well, if there are people who want this, this is something we should be doing. No community wants to shut its doors. But one of the things I think that is difficult is to understand how the experience of online worship is different than the experience of in-person worship. Our survey asked people about their experiences worshiping online, how it compared to their experience of worshiping before the pandemic, through a lot of different ways to try to get not just it was better or it was worse, but to see what the quality of the experience was and how it changed. One of the things that came up very much is that what people wanted and missed from online worship was a sense of community, was a sense that worship is something that we do together, that it wasn't private prayer, but that it was the sense of a community coming together for the purpose of worship. How do you do that? Traditionally, clergy have been very, very good at creating a sense of community when they're in the room with others. All of a sudden, all of that training becomes not relevant, or not relevant in the same way, when the tools that you're trying to use are not the subtle tools from the bema, from the pulpit, but Zoom, streaming, YouTube, Facebook, all these other things. One of the things we saw was that a lot of clergy were really worried about the notion of show, of performance. I don't know if any of you have been to visit online the Central Synagogue of New York, which puts a really beautiful service out there with really high, almost orchestral style singing, chazanut, a really beautiful product that looks as good as a television show, I would say. And that sort of thing exists. That scares clergy, because there's this sense that, well, people do pop around, people do shop, people do say, oh, I'm going to try this week, I'm going to go to this week, I'm going to check this out. And all of a sudden, the geographic boundaries that says, well, I can't just pop over to New York for a service, don't exist. So you can do that. What we found is that in the long term, that level of show or performance is not really what people want. They definitely want to shop around. They want to see this occasionally. But the real thing that folks want is to engage with a community. And that, in a sense, the more show there is, the less of a sense of community there is. Our research found, for instance, that very small congregations, those that had less than 20 people per week coming, tended to be better at providing a ritual experience that people liked and appreciated than the very large ones, or even the mid-sized ones. And problems of mistakes, like some of the technical difficulties we've had today, people losing their place, a little bit of tech weirdness, weren't really a problem for people. It didn't make them turn off the way it might, if you were watching a television show and there were just bad camera angles, things you couldn't see. It made it feel human, and that was the human connection that folks were looking for. So I would argue that the ideal number of errors, of mistakes to make in an online service is a small number. People want to be able to see and hear and participate, but it's more than zero. And one of the other things that I think people are starting to learn about, and I definitely see us doing this at the Ark, is thinking about, okay, given this digital technology, how do we make it feel like this is a communal experience? So people have been experimenting with Zoom, with chat, with that kind of thing. The problem with Zoom is that you lose control over it very quickly. It's very hard to follow. It gets chaotic, especially if you have more than about 10 people in the room. What I think the Ark does very well in terms of streaming a service on YouTube or Facebook, but using the chat so people can be involved and calling out that chat, so that if you say Shabbat Shalom from Dublin or from somewhere like that, you might get mentioned from the Bima. That instantly gives you a sense that I'm not just watching a show. I'm engaging in something that's happening live, even if I'm not physically there. And those sorts of little tricks and tips to take the technology that exists and using them to give people the experience they want is, I think, what we're going to learn more and more about as time goes on. But there's some challenges. And one of the big ones is the nature of community. We all kind of intuitively know what a religious community feels like. Traditionally, especially for the Christians, it was about a parish. It was about a local community coming together in a distinctive building to worship. Well, what does it mean when your members might never set foot in your building? Are they really members? Are they full members? Do we have kind of levels of membership? This is something that a lot of communities are wrestling with, and different religions have a different notion of what membership means. But I think nobody really wants two-tiered membership. On the other hand, you don't want to eliminate the in-person worship, which is still very, very powerful for so many people. So it's a question of how to extend that out with the technological tools available and allowing more people in without kind of dumbing it down and lowering it to the lowest common denominator. This is a challenge. I think we do it very well at the Ark, but it's an ongoing challenge that is not going to be solved just by snapping the fingers. And I think also communities, the expectation is higher now because it is easier to move around. The idea of the parish, that you just go to your local, is not going to work in the long run. And that puts pressure on communities to kind of use it in a commercial sense, provide a better product, but to really think about what does their congregation want? What does their congregation need? How do we make sure that it's being provided, and it's being provided in a way that feels tied into the community? So this involves, say, educational programming and bringing people in from all over the world, which you can do now more easily, not without some difficulty, but more easily. And thinking about how to make that experience of human connection, which is the core of it, work even through this technology. There are two kind of big challenges, though. There are two kind of places where that broader question of what community is works very well. The bigger question of what community is become more problematic. And I just want to end with these because I think that they force us to think really carefully about what we do and how we do it. One of them is, well, frankly, anything that involves the body. And I'm thinking in particular here of funerals. It is one thing to say we're gathering together for Kabbalat Shabbat online. It is a very different thing to say we are going to conduct a funeral entirely online. And I think it's both about not really yet having that sense of person-to-person connection, being as strong online as it is in person, but also the presence or the absence of that body. And we've come out of a pandemic. We're still in a pandemic, really. There are a lot of people who have lost people. There's a lot of grief that has to be dealt with, and is not necessarily being, and that it has happened at a time when the traditional means of dealing with that grief have been deeply, deeply strained. I think this is a challenge that most religious communities around Britain and around the world are going to be dealing with in the years to come. And the second thing is what I want to get the sense of kind of national community, or how we fit in, how individual communities fit into a larger society, say British society. One of the ways of thinking about that actually came with one of our case studies on chaplaincy. Now, chaplains, we were looking at prisons, hospitals, and care homes, do a lot of their work with serendipity, planned serendipity, but still. They come to the room, people ask them, people don't say, okay, I need a chaplain. They're in grief, they're in pain, they're dealing with something, and the chaplain is just there. That sense of just being there is very hard to do online. It's like the problem of browsing on Amazon versus browsing in a bookstore. We can just happen upon things in the real world, in the non-virtual world, a lot more easily than we can just happen upon things online. Basically, everything we do online is intentional, or is intentional by either us or by somebody else, by a social media company, say. One of the things these unexpected, unintentional, serendipitous encounters do is give more of a sense of how we fit into the wider society. Say, how is Britain dealing with COVID? And there is the worry that the more religious life retreats online, even that metaphor of retreat is maybe problematic, the more difficult it is to see how we experience our religious life as a part of a wider social world. I'm thinking, for instance, of Simchat Torah, or of when we dedicated the new scroll at the Ark, and we paraded it up and down Northwood High Street, and that was wonderful. And there were some very confused people at the pub, and that was one of the ways that we placed the Ark as part of the wider society of Northwood, of London, of Britain, and of Europe and the world. That is harder online. That doesn't happen as accidentally online. Those confused people in the pub might have asked some questions, might have realized, oh, that's what that building is, might have learned a little bit, might have learned something about their neighbors in ways that I think would be very helpful and healthy. That happens more difficult. That is done with much more difficulty online. That's a problem. And I think we need to think about how to maintain those broader social ties, even when we can retreat into online bubbles. These are problems that exist outside of the religious world as well, certainly in, say, the media landscape. But there are problems as well. I think we need to think about them. Those are some of the broad themes that came up. But I would be more than happy to answer any questions you have, or talk about more things if you'd like. There's plenty more I could talk about. Thank you very much. I can't hear anything. I'm sorry.
Can you hear us now?
I can hear you. No,
Wonderful. Okay, I'm very loud. I'm sorry. This is because Richard is sitting in the audience instead of doing the the sound. No. Please stay in the audience. It's fine, Richard. It's absolutely fine. So thank you so much, Josh, for your reflections. If there are questions, if there are questions in the sanctuary, you will have to use the microphone to ask Josh, because otherwise he won't be able to hear you. Or if there are any questions from anyone on the Zoom, if you would raise your virtual hand, then we will unmute you and hopefully Josh will be able to hear you. Or wave your real hand around as well, that's also fine. I can't see any virtual hands or real hands. Anyone in the sanctuary? Brian, why don't you just need to move to that microphone, because otherwise Josh will not be able to hear you. I don't know if that's Brian's microphone. You can take it off so that it's your height. Just take it out of the, it's just a clip. Or you do that, that's fine as well.
Josh, I think I recognise the problem that you have put forward, that how are we going to be a community? And I think the matter could get worse than it is now, because at least at the moment, we do know the actors around. We have known them well, and we see them, and we've got that sense of community there, and probably get on the phone to them afterwards or something. So when, if you passed on another few years, something more may have to be thought about on that subject.
Yeah, I think there's something, if you can hear me, thank you for that, Brian, I appreciate it. I do think, yeah, you're right. To some extent, it's one thing when online communication is a temporary measure connecting people who already know each other, right? It's a problem, but I think that's a solvable problem. It becomes more difficult to think about what is the nature of religious community if it's kind of online native. And the reality is that I think it's extremely unlikely that it's going to be online native wholly. I think the way forward, and I think most clergy I spoke with agree with this, is a hybrid where there is both an in-person and online. And as you can see, hybridity introduces far more difficulties, far more technical difficulties, and kind of performative difficulties than doing just one or the other. It's one thing to run a service in the room. It's one thing to run a service on Zoom. It's a whole other thing to do both at the same time. And I do think it's going to be a challenge when people who only met the Ark online say, as they should, I am a full member of the Ark. This is my synagogue. This is my community. And we want to say yes to them. We want to welcome them in. But it is going to be more difficult. And we have to think about what are the techniques we use to, how can we deploy the technologies that we have to make them feel fully included? And I think in the end, it's not going to be a matter of trying to map the experience of being an in-person member one-to-one to technology, but to say, okay, we have to acknowledge that it is in fact different, but not necessarily worse, just different. How we do that, what is the nature of that online community, I don't know. A lot of people have been talking about digital religion for decades before the pandemic, and frankly, it was always a fringe pursuit. And I think the big thing in the pandemic now is it's not a fringe pursuit anymore. It's the world we live in. So yes, I see the challenge that you point to, Brian.
Thank you, Josh. I can't see questions coming from our Zoom participants. There's just a few comments, a lot of food for thought. Thank you, Josh. Any other questions from those in the sanctuary? Otherwise, Mimi, perfect. Do come up to the microphone so that Josh will be able to hear you. You can take it, it just clips, yeah, that's it.
Hello, Josh. I just wanted to ask, your work has been on existing communities and what's happened to them during the pandemic. But I just wondered what your thoughts are on new communities that want to establish themselves. So I guess it's a bit of looking into the future in terms of what do we do, like if there is a small community that actually wants to set up, given that the difficulty about in-person services or in-person meeting.
I could actually hear that. I hope everyone else could. It's a really good question. We have seen some evidence of it. We have seen some new communities emerge. Almost always they're kind of budding off from existing communities. But that's how new communities form in general. So for instance, in the Orthodox Jewish world, we've seen the creation of a number of women's Rosh Chodesh celebrations online that, in a sense, were always possible before. But now, because everything is online, they are so much easier to do. They become a kind of norm. And I would be surprised if those don't keep existing for years to come and eventually kind of develop into their own, call it what you want, but their own thing. They're not necessarily tied to a specific synagogue. I could see that happening. We've definitely seen things that are not quite religious communities, but things adjacent to them. So, for instance, funeral practices or online memorials for people. Some of these are sponsored by some very large churches like St. Paul's. Some of them are not. We've seen virtual pilgrimage. People, sometimes even commercial companies, set up the idea of an online pilgrimage. This has been obviously especially important in the Catholic world, where via YouTube clips and commentary and a daily chat, you travel to the Holy Land or to somewhere else, and you have that experience of going on pilgrimage all from the comfort of your own home. These things are going to start to exist. I think in the Jewish world, we still think of almost everything as happening under the umbrella of a shul. This is a community that does this. In other religious traditions, that's less the case. In Islam, for instance, the mosque is where you pray, but there are lots of other Islamic institutions that do other things. We could be going in that direction. People have talked about entirely online religious communities for a very long time. I don't think they've really ever worked until now. And I think we are, partly this is why I bring up things like funerals and also, baby namings and breeds and weddings and that kind of thing. I think it would be very, very hard to have a community that exists entirely online. I think religion is going to be one of the last aspects of our life to go digital. It has been one of the last aspects of life to go digital. And I don't expect that to change.
So I think maybe a last. Oh, now we have loads of feedback. A last comment or question from somebody who is joining us only online on our live stream, but one of our absolute regulars and a supporter of the synagogue, Ellie Dankner, who is saying to us, you all do very well. I have never been to England except at the airport, but I always feel included and welcome. Zoom Kiddush certainly helps, and I'm glad that I now have a bunch of new friends. So maybe that is a wonderful way of wrapping up, and for us to say thank you once more to Josh for sharing some reflections with us, and Rabbi Aaron will hopefully join me on the bimah in a moment so that we can join together for candle lighting. So thank you very much again, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. And we're going to have Rabbi Aaron with us. The TV outside. I see.
We have our Holy Water bucket, most importantly. I'm wondering how many times people have lit candles today. Yesterday I reached 4 times, which is fantastic, with various different visits and school visits and different people's homes, which is wonderful. Today it's just my 3rd. My goodness, but the songs, the blessings are still the same. So please do join in.
I think because you have your mask on with your thing, it's making it difficult for the microphone to hear.
I'm going to put it last job as I get caught up in my colleagues. So let's see what we can do.
Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu להדליק נר של חנוכה ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שעשה ניסים לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה צור ישועתי לך נאה לשבח תיכון בית תפילתי ושם תודה נסבח לעת תכין מטבח מצהם נפח אז אגמור בשיר מזמור חנוכת המזבח אז אגמור בשיר מזמור חנוכת המזבח.
Whether you're in the sanctuary or whether you're in your small sanctuaries, thank you for being together in community and lighting our 4th night of candles together.
Absolutely, and we're going to say goodbye to those who are joining us on the live stream as we turn over to the chair of our synagogue, Susan Bubis, for our AGM.